My wife Celeste texted me at 6:47 a.m. I'm done pretending. This marriage is over. Don't contact me. I stared at those words while my coffee got cold, reading them 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. After 12 years together, this was how it ended. Not with a conversation or even an argument. Just 22 words that changed everything. I set my phone down on the kitchen counter and took a deep breath. For the first time in months, I felt something unexpected wash over me. Relief. Pure, clean relief that surprised me with its intensity. I had been drowning in our toxic cycle for so long that I'd forgotten what breathing normally felt like. The constant tension in my shoulders suddenly released. The knot in my stomach that had been there for years began to loosen. Maybe this text wasn't the end of my story. Maybe it was finally the beginning of something better. My name is Knox Brennan, and I run a small marketing agency from my home office in Portland, Oregon. At 34, I thought I had life figured out. Celeste and I lived in a modest craftsman house with a view of Mount Hood on clear days. She worked at an upscale boutique downtown and spent most evenings criticizing everything I did. How I loaded the dishwasher wrong, leaving water spots on the glasses. How my client calls were too loud and interrupted her favorite TV shows. How I never understood her emotional needs or spoke her love language properly. I'd started walking on eggshells years ago, constantly trying to avoid her explosive moods and unpredictable anger. Friends had stopped visiting because she made them uncomfortable with her sharp comments and cold silences. My business suffered because I was constantly stressed and distracted. But I stayed because I thought that's what good husbands do. They fight for their marriages, even when the fight is slowly killing them from the inside out. After reading her text message, I called my brother Zane, who lived across town in the Alberta Arts District. He'd been watching our marriage crumble for years, witnessing the gradual change in my personality from confident to anxious. She finally did it. I told him, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Celeste ended things over text. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear his coffee machine brewing in the background, the familiar sounds of his morning routine. Then Zane said something that completely surprised me. Knox, how do you feel right now? Really feel? Don't give me the answer you think you should give. Tell me what's actually happening in your body. I thought about it carefully, doing a mental inventory of my emotional state. The knot in my stomach that had been there for months was completely gone. The constant anxiety about what mood she'd be in when I got home had vanished like morning fog. I feel lighter, I admitted, almost whispering. Like I can breathe again. Zane was quiet for a moment, then said, Good. Maybe this is exactly what you needed to hear. I spent the entire morning walking through our neighborhood, really seeing it for the first time in years. The autumn leaves were brilliant gold and red, and I noticed how the morning light hit the old oak trees lining our street. The coffee shop owner, Mrs. Chun, waved at me through her window and smiled warmly. A neighbor I barely knew stopped to ask how I was doing, and I realized we'd never had a real conversation because I was always rushing home to manage whatever crisis Celeste had manufactured that day. When I finally returned to our house, I looked around with completely new eyes. Everything was arranged exactly how she wanted it, down to the smallest decorative detail. My books were hidden away in boxes in the basement because she said they looked messy and ruined the aesthetic she was trying to create. My guitar sat forgotten in a closet because she complained endlessly about the noise, even when I played softly with headphones. Even the walls were painted her favorite shade of beige, which I'd always found depressing but had agreed to because arguing wasn't worth the weeks of silent treatment that would follow. This wasn't our home. It was her home, and I was just living in it like a guest who'd overstayed his welcome and forgotten he had the right to leave. By afternoon, I decided to call my friend Thorne, a divorce attorney I'd met at a Chamber of Commerce networking event 2 years ago. We'd stayed in touch through occasional coffee meetings, and I knew he had a reputation for being both skilled and ethical in his practice. When I explained the situation, he listened carefully without interrupting. Knox, he said when I finished, I need to ask you something important, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Do you want to save this marriage? Is there any part of you that wants to fight for what you and Celeste had together? I expected to say yes automatically. That's what I'd been telling myself for months whenever friends asked if everything was okay at home. But sitting there in my kitchen, looking at the bruise on my forearm from where she'd thrown her phone at me the week before during an argument about dinner plans, I surprised myself completely. No, I said quietly. Then louder, no, I don't think I do. I think I've been holding on to something that died a long time ago. Thorne was quiet for a moment, and I could hear him taking notes. Then let's talk about protecting yourself and moving forward in the healthiest way possible for both of you. Thorne patiently explained the divorce process and helped me understand my rights under Oregon law. Oregon was a no-fault divorce state, which meant we could dissolve the marriage and split assets fairly without having to prove who was at fault for the breakdown. The house was in both our names, but I'd been making most of the mortgage payments from my business income for the past 5 years. My marketing agency was separate property since I'd established it before we married, which meant she had no claim to it or its assets. The key to getting through this with your sanity intact, Thorne explained, is to document everything carefully and stay calm no matter what happens. Don't engage in arguments or try to hurt her back, even if she tries to provoke you. Take care of your own interests legally and emotionally, but do it with integrity. He also strongly recommended that I start seeing a therapist immediately to process everything in a healthy way. Divorce brings out the worst in people sometimes, even good people. Having professional support will help you stay centered and make good decisions when emotions are running high. That evening, I called Dr. Waverly, a therapist specializing in life transitions that Thorne had highly recommended. She had an opening the very next day, which felt like a sign that I was moving in the right direction. I'd never been to therapy before, always believing I could handle my problems alone, but something about taking proactive action felt right and empowering. For years, I'd been completely reactive, always responding to Celeste's latest drama and constantly changing demands. Now I was making deliberate, thoughtful choices about my future for the first time in years. I also called my parents, who lived in Seattle and had been worried about me for a long time, but hadn't wanted to interfere in our marriage. "We're so proud of you for prioritizing your well-being," my mom said, and I could hear the relief in her voice. My dad added, "You deserve to be genuinely happy, son. Real happiness, not just the absence of open conflict." Their immediate support and understanding meant everything to me during those first uncertain hours. My first therapy session with Dr. Waverly was more eye-opening than I'd expected it to be. She helped me identify patterns in my marriage that I'd been completely blind to for years. How I'd been walking on eggshells constantly, monitoring Celeste's moods, and adjusting my behavior to avoid setting her off. How I'd gradually stopped pursuing friendships and hobbies because they inevitably caused problems at home, leading to accusations that I cared more about other people than about her. How I'd convinced myself that constantly apologizing and accommodating every demand was love, when really it was fear-based survival behavior. "You've been living in survival mode for years," she explained gently. "Your nervous system has been on high alert constantly, which is exhausting and unsustainable. Now we need to help you remember who you are when you're not just trying to keep the peace at any cost." She gave me homework that seemed simple but felt revolutionary. Make a list of things I had enjoyed before my marriage became so difficult and consuming. The list I created that night was much longer than I expected and made me realize just how much of my authentic self I'd lost over the years. 3 days after receiving the text, Celeste called my phone. I almost didn't answer, staring at her name on the screen and feeling my heart rate spike with the old familiar anxiety. But curiosity won out over avoidance. "We need to talk," she said, her voice completely different than I'd heard in months. Softer, less certain, almost vulnerable. It was the tone she used to use when we were dating, and she wanted something from me. "About what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral and calm. "About us. About fixing this mess and starting over." I felt something twist uncomfortably in my stomach. For a moment, the old Knox wanted to say yes immediately, to try again, to go back to the familiar misery that at least felt predictable. But then I remembered what Dr. Waverly had said about recognizing unhealthy patterns and breaking cycles that no longer served me. "Celeste, you ended our marriage in a text message at 6 in the morning. You specifically told me not to contact you. I'm simply respecting the boundary you clearly established." She was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear her breathing. "I didn't mean it like that," she finally said. "I was just angry about the fight we had. You know how I get when I'm upset." But I wasn't angry anymore. For the first time in years, I was completely clear about what I wanted. "I think you did mean it when you sent that text," I told her gently but firmly. "And I think you were absolutely right to end things." We've been hurting each other for a long time, Celeste. We bring out the worst in each other instead of the best. Maybe it's time to let each other go and find happiness separately. She started crying then, which used to make me panic and immediately try to fix everything, taking responsibility for her emotions and sacrificing my own needs. This time, I felt genuinely sad but also strangely calm and centered. The tears didn't trigger my old rescue response. You deserve to be happy, I continued, meaning every word. And so do I. But I don't think we make each other happy anymore. I think we just make each other tired and angry and small. After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long while, processing the conversation and marveling at how different it felt. I'd just had the most honest, direct discussion we'd shared in years. There was no yelling, no blame games, no manipulation tactics. Just truth spoken clearly and kindly. It felt like a small miracle, a glimpse of the person I used to be before I lost myself in trying to manage someone else's emotions. Over the following weeks, I started systematically reclaiming my physical space and my emotional life. I moved my guitar back to the living room and played for the first time in months, even though my fingers were rusty and the calluses had softened. The music felt like coming home to myself after a long, difficult journey. I reached out to old friends I'd lost touch with over the years, people I'd stopped seeing, because Celeste found reasons to dislike all of them. Most were incredibly understanding when I explained what had been happening in my marriage. My friend Casey immediately invited me to his weekly poker game with a group of guys I'd enjoyed spending time with before. Another friend, River, asked me to join his weekend hiking group, something I'd always wanted to do but had given up because Celeste hated outdoor activities and made me feel guilty for going without her. Slowly but steadily, I was rebuilding the social connections I'd allowed to wither and die. I also started redecorating the house, replacing Celeste's oppressive beige walls with colors that actually made me feel alive and energized. Each small change felt like reclaiming another piece of my authentic self. The legal process moved forward more smoothly than I'd dared to hope. Celeste had found her own attorney, and surprisingly, things remained relatively civil throughout the proceedings. Through our respective lawyers, we managed to agree on asset division without major fights or drama. She would keep her car, a Honda she'd bought before we married, and all of her personal belongings and clothing. I would keep the house, which made sense since I worked from home and had been making most of the payments, and my business with all its equipment and client relationships. We'd split our modest savings account 50-50, which seemed fair since we'd both contributed to it over the years. There was no alimony involved since we both had similar earning potential and no children to consider. The whole process felt refreshingly businesslike rather than emotional, which was exactly what we both needed to move forward. Thorne told me this level of cooperation was unusual for divorces, but I think we were both finally ready to move on rather than continue fighting about a past that couldn't be changed. My business started thriving in ways it hadn't in years, and I began to understand how deeply my personal stress had been affecting my professional performance. Without the constant tension and drama at home, I could focus properly on my clients and their needs. I landed 2 major accounts that month, including a tech startup that needed help with their entire marketing strategy. My creativity returned with a vengeance, and I found myself genuinely excited about projects again, staying up late not because I was avoiding going home, but because I was inspired and energized by my work. I realized how much my personal life had been affecting every aspect of my professional performance. One long-term client even commented that I seemed more energetic and innovative in our recent meetings, bringing fresh ideas and strategic thinking that had been missing for months. I started working from a coffee shop downtown a few days a week, enjoying the buzz of being around other people and the energy of the city. At home, I'd been isolated and anxious. Out in the world, I remembered that I actually enjoyed connecting with people and solving complex business problems creatively. Dr. Waverly helped me process some difficult but important realizations about my role in the marriage's dysfunction. I'd been so focused on being the good guy and avoiding conflict that I'd actually enabled Celeste's unhealthy behavior patterns. By constantly accommodating her demands and apologizing for things that weren't my fault, I'd inadvertently made our dynamic worse over time. You can't love someone into treating you well, she explained during one particularly insightful session. And by consistently accepting poor treatment, you inadvertently teach people that's all you expect from them. It becomes a self-reinforcing cycle. This was incredibly hard to hear, but absolutely crucial to understand. I wasn't responsible for Celeste's choices, emotions, or behavior, but I was completely responsible for my own boundaries and self-respect. Learning to value myself properly and maintain healthy limits was going to be essential for any future relationships, whether romantic, professional, or platonic. I had to learn to distinguish between being kind and being a pushover, between being supportive and being an enabler. One evening, I was at Casey's weekly poker game when someone casually mentioned seeing Celeste around town with a new guy, apparently someone she'd met through work. I braced myself for the familiar stab of jealousy, hurt, or anger, but it didn't come. Instead, I felt something remarkably like relief and even happiness for her. She was moving on with her life, which meant we'd both made the right choice in ending our marriage. "Are you doing okay hearing that news?" Casey asked later as we were cleaning up the cards and chips. I nodded honestly, surprised by my own emotional response. "Yeah, I really am okay with it. I genuinely hope she's happy and finds what she's looking for." And I absolutely meant every word. Holding on to anger, resentment, or hurt would only poison my own future and prevent me from building something better. The best revenge, I was slowly learning, wasn't revenge at all. It was building a life so fulfilling and joyful that you completely forgot why you were angry in the first place. 6 months after receiving that life-changing text message, our divorce was officially finalized. I expected to feel sad, nostalgic, or at least somewhat melancholy about the end of such a significant chapter in my life. Instead, I felt profoundly grateful. Grateful for the good times we'd shared during our early years together when we brought out each other's best qualities. Grateful for the difficult lessons I'd learned about myself, my patterns, and my worth. Most of all, grateful for the opportunity to start fresh and build something better. I celebrated that evening by cooking myself an elaborate dinner, something I'd always enjoyed but had stopped doing because Celeste criticized my cooking and preferred ordering takeout. Then I called my parents to share the news. "How are you really doing with all of this?" my mom asked, her voice full of concern and love. "Better than I have in years," I told her with complete honesty. "I feel like myself again, like I'm remembering who I was before I lost myself in trying to make someone else happy." That night, I sat on my back porch with my guitar, playing softly under the stars and marveling at how peaceful the house felt when it wasn't filled with tension and unspoken resentment. I joined a men's support group that Dr. Waverly had recommended, initially with some skepticism about whether it would actually be helpful. But listening to other men who'd been through similar experiences turned out to be incredibly valuable and healing. There was Jackson, who'd recently left an emotionally abusive marriage after 20 years and 2 children. Sterling, who'd discovered his wife was having an affair and had to rebuild his entire sense of identity and self-worth. Phoenix, who'd come to terms with being gay after decades of trying to make heterosexual relationships work. All of us were rebuilding our lives in different ways and facing unique challenges, but the common thread was learning to value ourselves properly and set healthy boundaries. We met every Thursday evening at a community center, and over time we became genuine friends who supported each other through the difficult process of personal growth. Having meaningful male friendships again felt like rediscovering a part of myself I'd forgotten existed during the years when all my emotional energy went toward managing my marriage. My relationships with family members improved dramatically once I was no longer constantly stressed and emotionally drained. Without the perpetual tension of my marriage consuming all my mental and emotional energy, I had space to invest in other people again. I started having regular video calls with my parents, really listening to what was happening in their lives instead of just going through the motions. My relationship with Zane deepened as we began talking honestly about things we'd never discussed before, including his own struggles with relationships and career decisions. He admitted he'd been worried about me for years, but hadn't known how to help without seeming interfering. "You seem completely different now," he told me during one of our weekly coffee meetings. "Like you're not carrying the world on your shoulders anymore. You're lighter, funnier, more like the brother I remember from before you got married." He was absolutely right. I'd been carrying the emotional weight of 2 people's happiness for so long that I'd forgotten what my own natural personality felt like when it wasn't buried under anxiety and stress. A year after the divorce was finalized, I decided to take my first solo vacation since college, booking a 2-week trip to Costa Rica. I'd always wanted to travel and explore new cultures, but Celeste had severe anxiety about flying and unfamiliar places, so we'd never gone anywhere more exotic than weekend trips to nearby cities. Planning the entire trip myself felt both exciting and slightly scary in the best possible way. I chose activities based solely on what interested me. Zip-lining through cloud forests, taking a photography workshop, learning to surf on the Pacific coast, and volunteering with a sea turtle conservation project. I ate at restaurants that looked interesting without having to worry about someone else's dietary restrictions or preferences. I spent hours exploring small towns and talking with locals without feeling guilty about spending time alone instead of entertaining a travel companion. The trip was absolutely transformative. I realized how much I genuinely enjoyed my own company when I wasn't constantly trying to manage someone else's emotions or meet impossible expectations. I came back feeling confident, adventurous, and reconnected with parts of myself I'd thought were gone forever. When I returned from Costa Rica, tanned and energized, I felt genuinely ready to consider dating again for the first time. Not because I was lonely or felt incomplete as a single person, but because I was truly happy with my life and thought it might be wonderful to share it with someone who was genuinely compatible. I tried online dating, but kept my approach casual, honest, and pressure-free. I was completely upfront in my profile about being recently divorced and focused on personal growth rather than jumping into anything serious quickly. I met several interesting women over the following months, but nothing developed into a serious relationship immediately, and I was perfectly fine with that. I was learning that being single wasn't a problem to be solved or a condition to be cured as quickly as possible. It was simply another way of living that could be completely fulfilling if you approached it with the right mindset and realistic expectations. I was building a life I loved, and if someone came along who enhanced it rather than complicating it, that would be wonderful. But my happiness wasn't dependent on finding that person. Eventually, I met someone truly special in the most ordinary way possible. I was working on my laptop at a coffee shop near my office when I noticed a woman at the next table struggling with what looked like design software. Her name was Sage, and she was a freelance graphic designer working on a complex logo project for a local nonprofit. We struck up a conversation when she muttered something about marketing budgets, and I ended up helping her think through some strategic questions about target audience and brand positioning. She was incredibly easy to talk to, genuinely funny without being mean-spirited, and seemed authentically interested in hearing about my business and experiences. We exchanged numbers and started meeting for coffee regularly, just as friends initially. What I appreciated most about Sage was how she communicated directly and honestly about her feelings, thoughts, and expectations. After years of trying to decode hidden meanings and navigate emotional minefields, her straightforward communication style felt like the most precious gift. We took things slowly and deliberately, both of us valuing the solid friendship we were building as much as the growing romantic connection between us. 2 years after receiving that text message that changed everything, I was sitting in my backyard on a perfect Sunday evening with Sage, playing guitar softly while she sketched in her notebook. We were planning a camping trip to the Oregon coast for the following weekend, and the conversation flowed easily between comfortable silences. My life felt genuinely full but never frantic, peaceful but never boring, challenging but never overwhelming. I found myself thinking about how dramatically different I was from the anxious, walking on eggshells man who had received Celeste's breakup text. That version of Knox had been constantly anxious, afraid of conflict, slowly disappearing into someone else's needs and demands until he barely recognized himself. This version of Knox knew exactly what he wanted from life, could express his feelings and needs clearly without apology, and wasn't afraid to be alone if a relationship wasn't genuinely healthy and mutual. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but it had been thorough and lasting. I'd learned to value myself properly and to choose relationships that enhanced my life rather than consuming it. "What are you thinking about?" Sage asked, looking up from her sketchbook with that warm smile that had first caught my attention. "Just how much my life has changed since my divorce," I told her honestly. That text from Celeste felt like the worst possible thing that could happen at the time. I was devastated and terrified. but it turned out to be exactly what I needed to finally make changes I'd been avoiding for years. Sage nodded thoughtfully. She knew my entire story and had shared her own experiences with difficult relationships and personal growth. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you ends up being the best thing, she said, setting down her pencil. But only if you choose to do the hard work of learning from it, instead of just becoming bitter and closed off. She was absolutely right. I could easily have spent the last 2 years angry, resentful, and closed off from new possibilities. Instead, I'd chosen the more difficult but ultimately rewarding path of growth, therapy, and remaining open to connection and love. I still see Dr. Waverly occasionally for what she calls maintenance sessions, checking in on my progress and working through new challenges as they arise. She helped me understand that truly healthy relationships require two complete, whole people consciously choosing each other every day, not two broken people desperately trying to fix each other or fill each other's empty spaces. My relationship with Sage is different from my marriage in every important way that matters. We communicate directly and honestly about both positive and negative feelings. We respect each other's boundaries and individual needs without taking them personally. We actively support each other's personal growth, friendships, and professional goals instead of competing with them or feeling threatened. We have disagreements and conflicts sometimes, like any couple, but we resolve them through patient conversation and compromise rather than manipulation, silent treatment, or emotional explosions. I never walk on eggshells or worry about accidentally setting off her temper. She encourages my friendships and hobbies rather than finding ways to undermine them. This is what genuine partnership actually looks like when both people are emotionally healthy. Looking back now with the clarity that only time and distance can provide, I'm genuinely grateful for that harsh text message that ended my marriage. Not because the way it was delivered was kind or considerate. It wasn't, but because it forced me to finally face a reality I'd been avoiding for years and make changes that transformed my entire life. Celeste actually did us both an enormous favor by being brutally honest about her feelings, even if her method was unnecessarily cruel. Sometimes the end of something painful and destructive is the essential beginning of something beautiful and life-giving. Through this experience, I learned that I'm much stronger and more resilient than I thought possible. I learned that I deserve to be treated with basic respect and kindness in all my relationships. Most importantly, I learned that being alone in content is infinitely better than being with someone who makes you feel small, anxious, and unworthy. That text message didn't destroy my life or break me as a person. Instead, it set me completely free to build the authentic, joyful life I actually wanted but had been too afraid to pursue. And for that unexpected gift of freedom and clarity, despite all the pain it initially caused, I'll always be grateful.